The wind howled across the frozen plains of Valtros, carrying with it the scent of distant storms. Commander Darius Kane stood at the edge of the settlement, his breath misting in the cold air as he gazed at the sky. The stars shimmered above, indifferent to the quiet life he had carved out here. His hands, once stained with the blood of war, now built homes, fixed machinery, and guided his son toward a future unshackled by violence. Leon, barely 14, was restless as always. He stood beside his father, shifting from foot to foot. "Do you think they'll ever find us here?" he asked. Darius turned, his sharp, battle-hardened features softening. "Not if we're careful," he said. "The Empire doesn't waste its gaze on places like this." Leon nodded, but a shadow of doubt lingered in his dark eyes. Darius had seen that look before, the hunger to understand a world larger than himself, the silent question of why they had to run. He had always dodged it, answering only in pieces, protecting his son from the weight of his past. A distant hum broke the night's stillness, faint at first, then growing. Darius stiffened, ears sharpening to the unnatural sound. Not thunder, not the wind. Engines. A lifetime of war trained him to react before thinking. He grabbed Leon's arm and pulled him toward the house. "Inside. Now." Leon hesitated. "What is it?" "Now." The boy obeyed, sensing the shift in his father's tone. Darius followed, shutting the reinforced door behind them. He reached for the rifle mounted above the hearth. The settlement had defenses, old pulse turrets, reinforced gates, but nothing that could hold against an imperial assault. Outside, the hum became a roar. The walls vibrated as shadowed figures descended from the sky, their forms sleek, armored, unmistakable. The Empire had come. Darius had spent years avoiding this moment. They shouldn't have known. They shouldn't have cared. But the past had long arms, and no matter how far he had run, it had found him. The first explosion rocked the ground. Screams tore through the night as buildings ignited. The settlers, farmers, laborers, exiles like himself, scattered like prey. Darius peered through the window, counting at least 3 troop carriers, each spilling out a dozen soldiers in black combat gear. A standard retrieval force. Not a full-scale purge. That meant they wanted something. Or someone. Leon. Darius turned to find his son standing frozen in the center of the room. His face was pale, his body locked in place by a terror he had never known before. Darius gripped his shoulders, forcing their eyes to meet. "Listen to me." His voice was steady, unshaken. "You run. Through the tunnels, the way I showed you. Do not stop. Do not look back. Get to the cliffs and wait for me." Leon shook his head. "I'm not leaving you. You don't have a choice." A heavy clang echoed through the house as the front door caved inward, torn from its hinges. Darius spun, rifle raised. The first soldier through took a shot to the throat, collapsing with a gurgle. The second fired, a searing bolt slicing across Darius's shoulder as he moved. Pain flared, but he ignored it, dropping the next attacker with a precise shot to the visor. Leon flinched at the sound of bodies hitting the floor, but there was no time for shock. Darius grabbed him, dragging him toward the rear exit. More soldiers swarmed the settlement, their coordinated movements cutting off escape routes. Darius fired, his shots precise, efficient, trained hands working on instinct. A few soldiers fell, but more replaced them. He was running out of time. A voice boomed over the chaos, amplified by an Imperial command unit. "Darius Kane, we know you're here. Surrender, and the boy lives." Darius's grip on the rifle tightened. They knew. He glanced at Leon, whose wide eyes flickered between terror and confusion. He didn't understand why they wanted him. Darius did. The Empire didn't take prisoners. They took leverage. Footsteps thundered outside. A stun charge clattered through the doorway, pulsing with energy. Darius shoved Leon down just as the blast detonated, sending a shockwave through the room. His vision blurred. His limbs refused to obey. He reached for Leon, but another blast sent him sprawling. Strong hands wrenched Leon away. He screamed, kicking, struggling, but the soldiers were too many. Darius fought to rise, but a rifle butt struck his skull, slamming him into darkness. By the time he came to, the settlement was quiet. Smoke curled into the frozen sky. Fires crackled, casting long shadows over the ruins. Bodies lay where they had fallen. Neighbors, friends, people who had built this place with their own hands. But Leon was gone. Darius forced himself up, every muscle in his body protesting. He staggered forward, toward the empty horizon where the Empire's ships had vanished. His hands trembled, not from weakness, not from pain, but from something far worse. Rage. They had taken his son. They had no idea what they had just unleashed. The cold no longer bit at his skin. The pain in his body had dulled to something distant, irrelevant. Darius moved through the wreckage of the settlement with measured steps, his eyes scanning the ruins for anything useful. The dead lay in the streets, their lifeless bodies half buried beneath falling snow. He forced himself to look, to remember. They had been good people. Farmers. Engineers. Families. None of them had deserved this. The Empire hadn't come to destroy the settlement, only to take what they wanted. And what they wanted had been his son. Darius clenched his fists, feeling the dried blood crack on his knuckles. His mind was already working, breaking down the situation into pieces he could control. The soldiers hadn't worn standard infantry insignia, no planetary occupation forces, no war banners. This had been a retrieval team, clean and efficient. That meant they hadn't taken Leon to execute him. They had taken him for something else. Leverage? No. If they knew who Darius was, they would have killed him on sight. Then why? The question burned in his mind, but it didn't matter, not yet. Leon was alive, and as long as that was true, there was a path forward. Darius walked to the remains of his home. The front door was gone, the walls scorched. The old rifle he'd used against the invaders lay in the snow, bent and useless. He stepped over it and moved to the back of the house. A hidden panel beneath the floorboards creaked open beneath his touch, revealing a small compartment. Inside lay a case, locked and untouched. His past, buried beneath years of pretending to be someone else. He opened it. A heavy pulse pistol, its grip worn from years of use. A combat knife, its blackened edge still sharp. And the final piece, a reinforced cuirass, the last remnant of his old armor, modified for speed over bulk. Darius stripped off his torn jacket and pulled the armor over his frame. It felt like slipping into a second skin, familiar and unyielding. He fastened the knife at his waist, holstered the pistol, and took a slow breath. The man he had been, the one he had tried to bury, was back. Outside, the wind carried the distant howl of scavengers drawn to the scent of death. Darius ignored them. He moved toward the outskirts of the settlement, where the bodies of the fallen soldiers lay cooling in the snow. He searched them methodically, his hands moving with an efficiency that came from years of war. The third body had what he needed, a datapad, its imperial interface still active. Darius powered it on, his fingers flying across the screen. Military clearance codes, tactical logs, a beacon signature, and there it was. A destination. A single transmission had been sent from this team's commander in the moments before they left orbit. Not to a standard Imperial warship, but to a classified research vessel. Darius didn't hesitate. He activated the beacon, forcing the pad to link with the nearest functional relay. Then, he sent a signal. Not to the Empire. Not to the settlement's useless distress network. To someone who could help. Minutes passed. The wind howled. And then, through the static, a voice crackled through the communicator. Darius Kane. A slow exhale. A voice from another life. Didn't think I'd ever hear that name again. Darius closed his eyes for a brief moment, centering himself. Then he spoke, his voice edged with steel. I need a ship. The silence on the other end stretched for only a second. And where are you? Valtros. The settlement's gone. A low curse. Empire. Yes. Another pause. Then the voice turned grim. You don't ask for help. Not unless it's bad. They took my son. Silence. Then the answer came, quiet but firm. Coordinates incoming. Be ready. Darius killed the transmission and let the cold settle over him again. The sky remained empty, the stars staring back at him with their eternal indifference. He flexed his fingers, feeling the weight of the pistol at his hip. They had taken his son. He was coming to take him back. The sleek black hull of the Vanguard barely reflected the distant starlight as it cut through the void, silent and invisible against the backdrop of space. Darius stood at the viewport, his gaze locked onto the looming structure ahead. Arction 9 hung in the darkness like a specter, its design brutal and unwelcoming, a floating fortress built for secrecy. The Empire had buried their worst sins here, hidden behind layers of security and forgotten by all but the most dangerous men in the galaxy. And now, they had his son. A low beep sounded behind him. "We're in position," said Raynor, his pilot, and, for better or worse, the closest thing he had to a friend left. Scanner sweeps show standard security protocols. Nothing too nasty. "You sure about this?" Darius turned, fastening the last strap of his reinforced vest. "Not even a little." Raynor snorted, tapping a few controls on the holo display. "Docking ports are locked down tight. You'll have to go in through one of the maintenance shafts. No alarms if we time it right." Darius moved to the weapons locker, selecting a compact plasma carbine. His old pistol was already secured at his side, the blade strapped to his forearm. He checked the charge, ensuring it was primed. "Extraction plan?" Raynor exhaled sharply. "Well, that depends on how loud you plan on being. You move fast, keep quiet, and I can keep the Vanguard within pickup range without raising too many flags. You get caught." He spread his hands. "You're on your own." Darius gave him a look. "I won't get caught." Raynor chuckled darkly. "That's the Kane I remember." He tapped a sequence into the control panel. "Airlocks cycling. Your window's small, move." Darius pulled his mask over his face and stepped into the airlock. The red light above flashed once, then turned green. The outer hatch hissed open, revealing the endless void beyond. The maintenance tether extended toward the station's underbelly, a single thin bridge between him and the fortress. He moved. The silence of space pressed in around him, his breath steady as he pulled himself along the tether. Arction 9 loomed larger with each second, its metal surface scarred from years of exposure and neglect. He reached the access panel, his fingers moving swiftly to disable the external sensors before cutting through the outer plating. The second hatch opened without resistance. He slipped inside. The maintenance corridors were tight and dimly lit, the air stale. No security presence, just as expected. He moved quickly, his body remembering the old patterns of infiltration, the quiet way to step, the way to keep his breath measured. Every turn he took brought him closer to the heart of the facility. The data pad on his wrist pulsed, highlighting a three-dimensional layout of the station. Leon's life signature flickered deep within the lower levels, locked behind layers of reinforced containment. Darius narrowed his eyes. This wasn't a simple detention block. It was something else. He kept moving. A low hum of distant machinery filled the corridors. Security patrols ran in predictable patterns, their movements rigid and rehearsed. Imperial protocol bred efficiency but not creativity, something he could exploit. He timed his movements, slipping past camera blind spots and guards with mechanical precision. As he neared the access lift, a new voice crackled over his earpiece. "You're close." "Raynor." Darius pressed a hand to his earpiece. "Talk to me." "There's a problem." There always was. The logs show an unscheduled transport docked 3 hours ago. High-clearance personnel, no identification tags. Darius exhaled sharply. "Imperial." "No. Worse. Black sigils." His grip tightened on his weapon. The Black Sigil operatives were beyond standard military. They weren't just enforcers, they were executioners. If they were here, it meant Leon wasn't just a prisoner. He was an experiment. Darius moved faster. The lift doors opened with a quiet hiss, and he slipped inside, overriding the controls to take him to the lower levels. The walls vibrated slightly as the cabin descended, the station's power core humming beneath the surface. He adjusted his grip on his weapon, every muscle coiled in anticipation. The doors opened. The corridor ahead was different, sleeker, colder. White lighting illuminated the metallic walls, casting long shadows from the thick security barriers. He moved carefully, bypassing the first set of sensors before pressing his back against a wall near a control panel. A lone guard stood ahead, his rifle slung lazily over his shoulder. Complacent. Unaware. Darius moved like a shadow, his blade flashing once, a silent flick of motion. The body slumped without a sound, and he caught it, lowering it to the ground before accessing the terminal. The reinforced doors ahead required genetic clearance. He glanced at the fallen guard, then at the blood pooling beneath him. He grimaced. It would do. He pressed the guard's hand against the scanner. The door clicked open. Inside, the room was dark, except for the dim glow of containment cells lining the walls. Transparent barriers revealed their prisoners, some restrained, others barely conscious. Imperial experiments. Failed test subjects. And then, Leon. Darius felt something tighten in his chest. His son was strapped to a medical table, electrodes attached to his temples, his small frame barely moving. He was alive, but only just. Darius stepped forward. A mistake. A sound behind him. He turned. A figure stood in the doorway, clad in black armor, a crimson sigil glowing on his chest plate. The operative's face was obscured by a helmet, but Darius could feel the weight of his gaze. "You should not be here," the operative said, his voice cold, mechanical. Darius raised his weapon. "And yet, here I am." The operative didn't flinch. "The boy belongs to us now." Darius' finger tightened on the trigger. The operative tilted his head slightly, as if amused. Then, without warning, he moved. Darius fired. The shot barely grazed the operative's armor before the man closed the distance, striking with brutal efficiency. Darius barely dodged in time, rolling to the side as a blade cut through the air where he had just stood. This wasn't a standard soldier. This was something else. The operative came at him again, but this time, Darius was ready. He sidestepped, driving his knee into the man's ribs before slamming his elbow into his helmet. The operative staggered, just enough for Darius to fire point-blank into his side. The shot hit hard, sending the man crashing into the wall. No time to finish it. Darius turned, sprinting to Leon's side. He yanked the restraints free, pulling his son into his arms. Leon stirred weakly, his eyes barely opening. "Dad?" Darius clenched his jaw. "I've got you." Behind him, the operative rose. Alarms blared. It was time to go. The alarms howled through the corridors, an urgent wail that reverberated off the cold metal walls. Red warning lights pulsed in rapid succession, bathing everything in a crimson glow. Darius moved with purpose, Leon's frail body cradled in his arms. The boy's breathing was shallow, his weight too light, his skin clammy. Darius forced down the surge of panic rising in his chest. Now was not the time. Behind him, the black sigil operative rose to his feet, the scorch mark on his armor a testament to Darius' shot. But the man did not falter. He did not waver. He merely reached up, unclasped his helmet, and removed it with a slow, deliberate motion. Beneath the armor, his face was lined with scars, his eyes the color of frozen steel. "You're making a mistake," the operative said, his voice eerily calm despite the chaos around them. Darius adjusted his grip on his son. "Yeah, I tend to make a lot of those." The operative took a step forward. "The child is no longer yours. You have no idea what he is." Darius pulled his pistol, aiming directly at the man's head. "He's my son." The operative exhaled slowly, almost disappointed. "Then you truly don't understand." Darius didn't wait for him to elaborate. His fingers squeezed the trigger, sending a charged plasma round hurtling toward the man's face. The operative shifted just enough for the shot to graze his cheek, burning a fresh scar into his already marred skin. He barely reacted. Instead, he lunged. Darius spun, using his momentum to deliver a brutal kick to the man's ribs while keeping Leon shielded. The impact sent the operative stumbling, but not down. Not out. Darius didn't have time for this. With one swift movement, he turned and bolted down the corridor. His muscles burned, every step fueled by desperation. Leon barely stirred in his grasp, his breath a faint whisper against Darius' chest. The facility's security was fully engaged now. Automated turrets slid from the ceiling, their targeting systems locking onto him. A burst of plasma fire scorched past his shoulder as he dove behind a support column, shielding Leon with his body. The heat singed the air, the smell of burnt metal thick around him. His earpiece crackled. "Darius, you're running out of time," Raynor's voice came, laced with urgency. "The whole station's going into lockdown." Darius gritted his teeth. "Tell me something I don't know." "There's an emergency ejection platform on the sublevel maintenance pods. They're not made for long range, but I can pick you up if you clear the atmosphere." Darius peeked out, gauging the nearest path. "Coordinates." A brief pause. Then, "Sending now." His wrist display flickered as the route uploaded. 3 floors down. Not impossible. But with Leon in his arms and the entire station hunting him, not exactly easy. He took a breath, centered himself. Then, he moved. Plasma fire erupted in his wake, the walls searing with impact points as he weaved through the chaos. The Black Sigil operative was behind him, relentless, unwavering. Every time Darius glanced back, he saw those cold, calculating eyes tracking him, moving with a predator's patience. A stairwell came into view. He took the steps 3 at a time, boots slamming against the metal grating. The station shuddered, whether from weapons fire or external pressure, he didn't know. He only knew he had to keep moving. The sublevel door loomed ahead. He reached it, slammed his palm against the panel. It didn't open. "Raynor. Hold on, bypassing now." The panel flickered, then turned green. The door hissed open. Darius stumbled inside, nearly collapsing against the wall. The emergency pods lined the far end of the chamber, their small, cylindrical forms designed for quick evacuations. He moved toward one, lowering Leon carefully into the seat. The boy stirred, eyelids fluttering. "Dad?" Darius brushed his fingers over Leon's hair. "I've got you, kid. Stay with me." Behind him, footsteps. Darius turned, pistol raised. The operative stood in the doorway, unfazed. "This isn't over," the man said. Darius fired. The operative dodged, the plasma shot striking the wall behind him. He moved with unnatural speed, closing the distance in seconds. Darius barely managed to block as the man's fist collided with his forearm, sending a sharp jolt of pain through his limb. His grip on the pistol faltered. The operative struck again, this time driving his knee into Darius' ribs. The breath left his lungs in a painful exhale. But he didn't go down. He twisted, using the momentum to grab the operative's arm and slam him into the bulkhead. The impact sent vibrations through the metal, but the man barely reacted. "You think this ends with you escaping?" the operative growled. "The Empire will never stop hunting him." Darius didn't respond. He slammed his fist into the man's jaw, forcing him back just enough to grab his sidearm. With a quick movement, he jammed the barrel against the operative's chest and pulled the trigger. The blast sent the man sprawling. Darius didn't wait to see if he got back up. He turned, sprinting to the pod, sealing Leon inside. His son's eyes fluttered open, dazed but aware. "Hold on tight," Darius said. Leon reached for him, but the hatch sealed before their hands could meet. Darius slammed the release. The pod's thrusters ignited, blasting it into the void. The station shuddered violently as explosions rocked its structure. The alarms changed tone, structural collapse imminent. Darius exhaled, then turned to face the Black Sigil operative once more. The man was rising, slow but steady. Blood dripped from his mouth, but his expression was unreadable. Darius clenched his fists. This wasn't over. The night on Arction, 9 burned. Smoke curled into the atmosphere, thick and black, blotting out the twin moons above. Fires raged through the compound, sending plumes of embers swirling into the frozen winds. Bodies littered the ground: soldiers, mercenaries, Black Sigil operatives. They had come expecting to crush a lone, desperate man. Instead, they had unleashed something far worse. Darius moved through the wreckage, his breath visible in the frigid air. His coat was torn, stained with soot and blood, none of it his own. The rifle in his hands hummed as he reloaded, the faint blue glow of the energy cell flickering before it locked into place. Ahead, the final stronghold of the Black Sigil loomed. A fortress carved into the mountainside, its jagged towers rising like frozen fangs against the darkened sky. The last bastion of those who had taken Leon. The last place he needed to burn. His earpiece crackled. "Darius, you're pushing too deep," Raynor's voice warned. "Sensors show reinforcements inbound. You need to pull back." Darius didn't respond. He stepped over a fallen enemy, boots crunching against the icy ground. His path was clear, straight through the main gate. There was no retreat. Not now. The enemy had finally realized it. Turrets activated along the perimeter, their targeting systems locking onto his heat signature. Spotlights flared, cutting through the smoke and snow, painting the battlefield in stark white light. The storm of gunfire came a second later. Darius moved before the first shot landed, diving behind the wreckage of an armored transport. Plasma bolts seared against the metal, melting through in places. He needed to move fast. He reached into his belt, pulling free a pair of high-impact grenades. With a flick of his wrist, he sent them sailing toward the turret emplacements. They detonated mid-air, sending a concussive shockwave that tore through the defenses. Darius was already moving. He sprinted through the smoke, weaving between debris and fallen soldiers. The Black Sigil's forces scrambled, their precision breaking under the sheer force of his assault. They had never expected one man to push them this far. But Darius was no ordinary man. He closed the distance in seconds, his rifle raised. The first guard barely had time to register his presence before Darius fired, the energy round piercing through his chest. The next swung a blade, but Darius ducked beneath the arc, driving his elbow into the soldier's throat before finishing him with a clean shot to the head. More came. More fell. The entrance was within reach. Then, the cold voice rang out. "Stand down." Darius stopped. The Black Sigil operative stood atop the stronghold steps, his dark armor catching the firelight. He looked untouched by the chaos, unshaken. The same icy stare. The same unrelenting presence. Darius tightened his grip on his rifle. "You know that's not happening." The operative sighed, almost regretful. "Then you leave me no choice." The ground beneath Darius trembled. A massive mechanized warframe stepped forward from the shadows, its twin cannons glowing with power. A machine built for extermination. Built for war. Darius exhaled slowly. He ran straight at it. The warframe's cannons roared, unleashing a storm of plasma. Darius rolled, barely dodging the first barrage. The heat scorched the air, but he didn't slow. He darted left, then right, unpredictable, forcing the targeting system to lag behind. He leaped onto a fallen transport, using the momentum to propel himself higher. The warframe recalibrated, adjusting its aim. But it was too slow. Darius landed on the machine's arm, gripping the plating as it attempted to shake him off. He climbed swiftly, his fingers finding purchase in the gaps between armor. The warframe twisted, trying to dislodge him, but he had already reached its core. With a single, precise motion, he planted a charge against the exposed power unit. Then, he jumped. The explosion sent him hurtling through the air, heat licking at his back. He crashed into the snow, rolling with the impact. Behind him, the warframe staggered, its systems failing. Sparks erupted from its joints before it finally collapsed, crashing into the ground with a deafening impact. Silence. The Black Sigil operative remained standing, unfazed. Darius rose, breathing hard. "Your move." For the first time, The operative hesitated. Then, he drew his blade. The two men charged. Their weapons clashed, steel meeting steel, energy crackling between them. Darius parried the first strike, countering with a brutal punch to the ribs. The operative grunted but retaliated, slicing a shallow cut across Darius' shoulder. Pain flared, but Darius ignored it. He pressed forward, attacking with relentless precision. The operative blocked, dodged, but Darius could see it, the cracks forming. This man had been trained, honed into a perfect weapon. But Darius was something else entirely. He was a father with nothing left to lose. With one final movement, he twisted past the operative's guard, driving his blade deep into the man's chest. The operative exhaled sharply. His eyes widened, shock flashing across his face. Darius leaned in, voice a low growl. "You took my son." He twisted the blade. The operative crumpled, collapsing to his knees. His breath was shallow, his gaze unfocused. Darius stepped back, watching as the man fell, the life leaving his body. It was over. The fortress lay in ruin, its defenders broken. The black sigil had been dismantled, its grip shattered. Darius turned away from the wreckage, the cold wind whipping against his face. His battle was done. But the war was far from over.